Production of A Good Read on Maine PBS is made possible in part by the Verizon Foundation, supporting literacy programs and partnerships reaching adults and children across America on the web at verizonreads.net.
I cannot tell you how many hundreds, literally, of people over the years have told me they dislike poetry because it was taught to them as a search for meaning. And if you don't know the meaning, you're stupid. Cheerful for looking out the window at ice-whiskered nothingness and knowing there would be a day, an event sponsored by galaxies, God, and gravity. Choose one or choose them all.
Hi, I'm Sandy Phippen, your host for A Good Read. Maine's second poet laureate loves to write about pop culture as well as the contrasts in his life between an urban upbringing and a rural adulthood. Baron Wormser is a former librarian and teacher who worked in Maine schools for more than 25 years. He has 5 published collections of poetry as well as a guide to the teaching of poetry, and he's won the prestigious Catherine A. Morton Prize in Poetry. The Baltimore native came to Maine in the Back to the Land movement in the early 1970s. Baron, when you were a kid growing up in Baltimore, did you dream about becoming the Poet Laureate of Maine?
No, that was not one of my dreams when I was a kid growing up in Baltimore.
Did you even know about Maine then?
No, I really didn't focus particularly on the state of Maine growing up in Baltimore, no.
But you have become the Poet Laureate of Maine, and how has that been? What has it been like?
Well, it's an honor that I appreciate. It is an honorary position, so as with many honorary positions, nothing in particular happens beyond that you have the honor. There are no duties or responsibilities concerning the position.
Since that time, you have been pretty visible. I mean, you've been asked to come all over the state, haven't you?
Well, I work in schools a fair amount, so due to my interest in poetry and its teaching, I have been in a number of schools throughout the state of Maine.
In becoming Poet Laureate of Maine, though, and you're not from Maine. I mean, you've been here for 30 years, but...
From away.
Yes, from away. So I wanted you to talk about that a little bit, the whole novelty of that.
Well, historically, my wife and I would be part of the Back to the Land movement in the late 60s, early 70s, and really wanted to live in a rural area, and through a series of circumstances came to be in Maine and wound up living in the village of Head Tide, actually across the Sheepsgood River from Edwin Arlington Robinson's home where he was born, and liked Maine a great deal and wanted to stay in Maine.
I want to go back, though, before we go deal with Maine, and go back to Baltimore. Mm-hmm. Describe what it was like growing up in Baltimore in the late 40s. You were born in 47?
48, yeah.
48. Your family, what was your family like?
My father was an accountant in Baltimore. My mom was an English teacher. She taught at the high school, had a very small family, so not that many relatives in Baltimore.
Okay. You went to the public school system?
I did. I went to what's called in Baltimore City, known as Baltimore City College, even though it's a high school. It was a college for 2 years in the 19th century, I think, and they held on to the name. It was somewhat unusual in that it was an all-boys high school.
Mm-hmm.
So
it changed now. It's changed probably.
now it's co-ed.
Co-ed
Right. School. Yes.
Okay.
And it was a magnet school, so kids from all over, guys from all over the city of Baltimore went to school there. So again, a great education in terms of different kinds of people.
Right, right, and good academically, isn't it too? I would say.
It was a very good school academically.
Then you went to Johns Hopkins.
I went to Johns Hopkins. I stayed in Baltimore, and was an English major at Johns Hopkins.
Did you stay at home, or did you live in the dormitory?
I lived at home. I was going through A difficult time at home. My mother was very sick. Essentially, she was dying of cancer, and I lived at home to help with her.
Mm-hmm. Now, literary influences, of course. As you were growing up in Baltimore, what did you read?
Everything. Baltimore is pretty notable for having an excellent library system, the Enoch Pratt Free Public Libraries of Baltimore. And so I grew up in a family. My mom was a great reader, being an English teacher. And for most of the years of my growing up in Baltimore, I went to the library pretty much every week and read. So I read a lot.
But you didn't know you were a poet then, did you?
No, I did not. It had not appeared, any physical manifestation had yet to appear. So I just read fiction, poetry, nonfiction, pretty much everything I could read.
Any authors that stood out that were very popular, who were like heroes to you? You wouldn't miss anything that they'd written? Edgar Allan Poe, he has Baltimore connections.
I think typical of my era, certainly a writer such as Salinger was a huge writer for me. But I read a lot of classic American fiction. I mean, I read my way through Fitzgerald and Hemingway, and read lots of Mark Twain, and read the great American writers.
Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson.
Right. Well, that was part of my upbringing, in that my mom would actually read poems aloud in the house.
That's important.
So I heard poetry.
You majored in English at Johns Hopkins?
I did.
With the idea of becoming a teacher?
With no vocational idea whatsoever.
And then, of course, what time are we talking about? What year, 60s?
69 I graduated.
Okay, so things were picking up then. We had our generation. I mean, we had civil rights going on in the 50s and 60s, and then Vietnam, too,
Right.
at the same time. How did you keep out of the service?
Well, I was actually drafted. I was deferred as an undergraduate.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was drafted, although I was in graduate school. And there's a poem maybe it's in When, called Draft Morning, about, I was living in California at the time, and I was drafted and declared 1Y, psychologically unfit, which from the Army's point of view was very true.
So you were happy. You escaped.
Well, yeah, I wasn't sure what would happen, actually. I was one of those people who wouldn't probably have been a conscientious objector, wouldn't have gone to Canada, probably would have been a go-to-jail draft resistor.
And we did talk about marijuana, dope. We're of that generation, after all. You've written about LSD, and you've written about marijuana, and I think hash, and so on.
Right, certainly my generation is the generation that
Dropped out.
experimented and experienced the world of drugs.
That's right.
And obviously, America is still coming to grips, trying to come to grips with what that means for a society.
How do you feel about that, Baron, now?
Well, the planet has kept spinning.
So as the time went on, you graduated from Johns Hopkins. You went to California. Where did you go to graduate
Right,
school?
I went to graduate school for a year at University of California at Irvine.
At Irvine, okay.
And didn't like Southern California at all. One of the jokes is that I live in Maine because it's so far away from Southern California. And we knew we didn't want to stay there, so after a year, we left.
You were married then?
Yes, I was.
Okay, and which leads to, of course, the building of your own house here in Maine. So when you came to Maine, the back to the land thing now, when you came to Maine in 1969, how did you decide on where to go to?
Well, actually, we lived this year in around 71 in Head Tide, and then, well, this is a lovely place. We like this this part of the world. How are we going to earn a living here? And having this background that I told you about, I was very much attracted to the world of libraries. At that time, the University of Maine at Orono had a library program, and I went there and got a degree and we lived in Bangor for a year. And then basically I decided I wanted to work in schools and interviewed for a number of jobs and wound up going to Madison. We lived in Madison for 2 years. 1 year we lived on Main Street in an apartment in Madison. The same year the Rolling Stones put out their Exile on Main Street album. And then we lived in the country in Madison for a year. And then around 1975, we
Bought the land.
bought land in Mercer and built a house with the considerable help of a local carpenter and members of his family in Mercer.
And you wanted a house with no electricity, and you heated with wood.
Heated with wood.
Did you have a
Had
well?
a pitcher pump
Mhm.
in the house running off a dug well,
Mhm.
and lived very simply and lived there for 23 years.
You had a garden. Did you garden? Raise your
Yeah,
own
we
food?
did all that stuff.
Raise
We
your own food, yeah.
had big gardens and vegetable garden and flower gardens and cut wood and
And raised 2 children.
raised 2 children. Annuals for my wife Janet. Grays, browns, mottled blacks, whether withered, frost attacked, or simply deceased, all annuals go into this heap from which others will derive increase. Death has its small uses, and you, my wife, and a gardener are respectful and sensibly sad. The commands of the seed contain no surprise, yet we oohed and awed as if each bloom were somehow unforeseen. Though lovingly saluted, beauty will not be known. The purposing bee explains nothing. These stringy petals and brittle leaves bequeath no aesthetic moralities. Crumble of earth and stems, we minister to each other. The blossom of a memory succumbs to its vigor, but will revive, you say, another summer, displaying the calm insouciance of what never went away.
Did Maine inspire you to be a poet?
Well, certainly the natural beauty is inspiring, but also the people
Mm-hmm.
are very inspiring in terms of the realities that I encountered in Maine. Very different from where I grew up. Obviously, I grew up urban, very rural. People's lives and coming into very close proximity with people's lives has had an incalculable influence on me as a writer.
Okay, so in college then, did you know then that you wanted to be a poet? When did this happen? When did you know you...
I wouldn't say I knew I wanted to be a poet. I liked to write. I wrote poetry as an undergraduate, but I didn't have any clear sense of that I wanted to be a poet. I liked to read poetry. I liked poetry a great deal, but I actually didn't start writing poetry in earnest until I was around 30 years old.
Here in Maine?
Here in Maine. So I wasn't a prodigy, as it were. In my 20s, I did a couple writing projects that were never published, but were of great value and interest to me. I wrote a novel that took place in Maine, based on a Turgenev novel.
Like Fathers and Sons or something?
Called Home of the Gentry. And I also wrote a book with a guy about architecture, too, which was a little ahead of its time, and we didn't have the credentials to get such a book published. Well, my publishing story is fluky, because I had written this novel that I told you about. I sent it to a novelist whose work I liked very much, and he was very intrigued by it. He turned out to be a Turgenev fan, too. So he said, I'm going to try to help you get this published. So I sent it to Knopf, and eventually, those wheels turned slowly, got a letter back from an editor, Knopf, saying, we don't really think this is a book we want to publish, but we do think you are a writer, and if you do any more writing, send it our way. So then I started writing poetry, and at that time, Knopf had a poetry editor. They still do, actually, though a different person, and I sent it to her. And again, those wheels turned very slowly, but she sent my work to Poetry Magazine in Chicago, at that time edited by John Frederick Nims, poet and wonderful writer about poetry. And eventually I heard from them. Poetry used to do an issue of people who were appearing from the first time. And I appeared in poetry, a number of poems appeared in poetry. And then I heard from an editor at Houghton Mifflin who really liked my work and was interested in publishing me. And that's how
The White
I
Words came
became
about.
a Houghton Mifflin writer.
And you did 2 books with
I
Houghton
did
Mifflin.
2 books with
The White
Houghton
Words
Mifflin.
and Good
Yeah,
Trembling.
mhm.
And then how come you didn't continue with Houghton Mifflin?
My editor was let go by Houghton Mifflin, as happens often in the publishing world. A new editor came in. He was not interested in me or my work, and I was shown the door.
Well, The White Words, I think one of the ways to do this, probably because there's so much to talk about in so little time, Baron, the titles. Why The White Words? I know it's a poem in the book,
Right.
but why The White Words? I love your titles, incidentally.
Thank you. Well, it has to do with language. Poets are people who are obsessed with language. Poets practice poetry, which is the art of language. That's one definition of poetry. And that poem has great meaning to me because it's about language in terms of how much it can console a person. It's about my being with my mother at her bedside in the hospital during her long bout with cancer, and how much language could console her and what language cannot do. So white is, of course, the color of invisible, that which cannot be seen,
Right.
that which isn't there.
The next book was Good Trembling.
That's a strange title.
Mm-hmm.
Fluky. That's a 60s title. I told the illustrator that I wanted a 60s cover, and I think he did a pretty good job. Well, poetry is emotional, and it is a form, you know the phrase of Kierkegaard's fear and trembling, and poetry to me is good trembling. It's physically moving in a positive way, in a powerful way, even though it may touch on sad and even tragic events. It makes us feel alive, and that's a kind of trembling, a kind of emotional vibration.
Also, it has something to do, you love jazz. We didn't talk about music, but jazz features throughout your work.
Mm-hmm.
And pop culture does
Mm-hmm.
too.
Right.
There's a lot of pop music in there
Right.
too. You've done poems to Elvis Presley and John Lennon.
Right.
Third book was called Adams, Soul Music and Other Poems.
Right.
And in that book, half the book at least, is devoted to one
Long
poem.
right.
Yes.
Well, I, as you, grew up in the world of the Cold War, was always used to seeing headlines about Reds, and grew up with the atomic bomb, grew up with the world of spy planes, summit conferences. And I wanted to try to write about that. I deeply believe that poets should try to write about the world they live in. I believe that poetry definitely, as is common throughout the rest of the world, has a political aspect to it. The great question, of course, is how to do that in terms of not being simplistic, in terms of trying to write about politics as it influences our daily lives.
Next book was called When.
Right. I'm a narrative writer. When is a crucial word for a narrative writer because it is a, it provides momentum. It's an initiator. It's a springboard for narrative writing.
When is something going to happen?
When Joe walked in the room and saw Susie, and you're off to the races. So when is a crucial word for me.
Mulroney and Others. That's the latest book of your poetry to come out.
Right. Well, I write about people, so I wanted to have a title that, as it were, paid attention to that fact. So Mulroney there's a poem called Mulroney. He's a character, and I write about people, so
He's wonderful.
others.
I like Mulroney very much, definitely. And then you took a time away from your poetry work to produce a book called Teaching the Art of Poetry, The Moves.
Right.
Could you describe the moves to us?
Well, it's a book that is a guide to poetry. It is aimed specifically at teachers, classroom teachers, though anyone can read it who wishes to learn about the art of poetry. Essentially, we wanted to write, my co-author and I, David Capella, with whom I go far back. He taught with me at Madison in the mid-'80s. But we wanted to write a book that would make poetry accessible and present it as an art, because poetry is an art. It's not a trove of hidden meanings to be found through an arcane search, but rather an accessible art that can be taught to any age as an accessible art. So we wrote that book.
What bothers you about the way poetry was taught in your time and what you've seen?
Typically, it was taught as hidden meaning or meaning, and the teacher has the meaning, and you have to get the meaning, and if you don't know the meaning, you're stupid. And I cannot tell you how many hundreds, literally, of people over the years have told me they dislike poetry because it was taught to them as a search for meaning. So it is a word that does not occur in the entire book. We managed to discuss poetry without using that word.
No meaning at all. That's great. So how do you think poetry should be taught?
Part of experiencing the poem is hearing the poem, and then, depending on the poem, actually writing the poem down. You want to get the words into your bloodstream. You want to physically experience the poem. There is no better way to do that than to write it down word by word, comma by comma, because then you will be focusing on how the poet wrote the poem. He did not write it as a search for meaning. The poet wrote, he or she, word by word, in terms of constructing the poem, and comma by comma, and space by space, and line by line, and stanza by stanza. And so there is a lot to be said, as foreign language teachers know, or teachers of English as a second language, for actually writing lines down on paper or on your laptop if you have a laptop.
You did mention, too, it made me think about this, you can also teach grammar well through poetry.
Absolutely. There is probably no better way to teach parts of speech than poetry. Poets are people who think very carefully about how many adjectives go into a poem, the sorts of verbs they use, the quality of nouns they use.
Looking for the right word.
Absolutely. Poetry is obsessed with word choice. That's what poetry is about. Poets are people who lie awake at night thinking about the difference between small and little.
Very important. Thank you, Baron.
You're welcome, Sandy. Cheerful, not passable, not special, not ostensible, but cheerful, as in rising in the winter darkness of a northern morning, and while walking down the worn barewood stairs to the kitchen and the cold cook stove, whistling, for the sake of being in a relatively warm body, for the sake of sliding fingers along the smooth rail, for the sake of being eager to start a fire exactly as she liked to start it, with shredded newspaper, split kindling, and a bit of birch bark, and there it went, the glow, a tiny whiff of smoke, and the ardent promise of heat, cheerful, in her mind that knew which pan to take down, how much butter to put in that pan, how many days butter was left in the fridge, how much butter cost at the A&P, cheerful for looking out the window at ice-whiskered nothingness, and knowing there would be a day, an event sponsored by galaxies, God, and gravity. Choose one or choose them all. All were plausible. Sunlight was a hymn, though she knew more than to tell the preacher. Half-overalled husband, cranky, the boys cuffing each other and muttering mocking words beneath their sleep-furred breath, and she cheerful to their faces like an opera singer exiled by catastrophe to some cow town, who rose in the shivery blank morning and sat on the edge of her gray narrow bed and began, despite herself and because of herself, to whistle an intractable aria.
For more information about A Good Read, visit our website at npbc.org. You'll find transcripts of interviews, biographies of each of the authors, a complete list of their published works, and you can join me on our new online book club to share thoughts about the writers featured on this series.
Production of A Good Read on Maine PBS is made possible in part by the Verizon Foundation, supporting literacy programs and partnerships reaching adults and children across America on the web at verizonreads.net.